Now we're going to create our branch template file. I'm going to start out by hitting Control N on the keyboard, or going to File and New. And we are going to create a 1024 by 1024 pixel image. And I'm going to call this branch template. And I just want to create some very simple branches and just a small amount of them, because really what we'll be able to do is just create a couple of these different files, and then within View, customize them, move them around in order to create the type of branch group that we would like. I'm going to start out by creating a rounded rectangle, and I'm going to set our radius to 100, and now just draw out a shape going from almost all the way at the top to the bottom. And then we can right mouse click on our layer and go to rasterize. I'm just going to move that a little. And now what I want is to free transform this. So we can hit Control T on the keyboard to open up free transform. And I'm going to change this to distort. And I'm just going to bring in those top two control points on the left and the right, just to move that in a little and have our branch thinning out towards the end. And you may need to zoom in a little and adjust that a little more. Hit Enter. And if we need to, I'm just going to go back in and adjust that just a little bit more. Control T, distort. And we'll just pull that in. Take a look at it. And that should be a good starting point for our branch. Now, before I do anything else, I'm going to change our layer name to branch. We'll try that again. Type it a little quick here. We'll just call that branch. And this is going to be our starter branch. So I'm going to create a new group. And basically what I want to do is just create copies. So I'm going to call this copies. And I'm going to create a copy of the branch, put it into our copy group, move our copy group down to the bottom. And I'm going to double click on our background and rename it background, and then take our copies and move that down below. And that way those won't show up, but we have a nice little group we can use to create kind of backups of these different shapes so that we can go back and use them without the modifications that we're going to be applying. Now with our new branch, the original, I'm going to hit Control T, and then what I want to do is just rotate this off to the side a little, so it's going at almost a 45-degree angle. It's a little bit less than that, but this is going to make it easier for us to use the warp tool. So we'll hit Control T again, select warp, and now we can use this warp tool to adjust the shape and have a little bit of variation in our branch so it's not perfectly straight. Now the reason I really rotated that is because if we did use the warp tool with it standing straight up, then we'd only be able to really move it side to side. Not a lot of control points, not a lot of area in order to make adjustments. And actually, I'll go ahead and show you that right now. Just hit Escape, and if we go to our history, I can turn off that and just delete that free transform, hit Control T. Oh, got to make sure we're selected on the correct branch. Go to warp, and now we can see it's really kind of difficult to make these adjustments. You have to select all 3 points in order to move these over. So it's really kind of hard to use that way, and which is why we're rotating it. Go back, and now we have these larger control areas to adjust our shape. It makes it a lot easier. And we could pull this up a little on the top, maybe thin out the branch a little bit more towards the end. Hit Enter, Control T to free transform it once again. And now we have a main branch shape that we can start creating copies of and creating a little bit of a layout. And like I said, we just want to create a very small layout because we're going to be able to copy these small sections over into larger sections, which is really going to turn into more than one view template. But it'll end up being a lot easier in the end, especially when you want to animate your leaves and create a dying leaf effect and things like that. A lot easier ways to create those different types of scenes. And I want to rename this to branch curved, and we're going to create another copy and drag that down into our copy section in our copy group. And now what I want to do is just start creating other copies of this branch and start to kind of create a shape for this segment. I'm going to free transform, just rotate that a little. With V selected, hit V for the move tool, hold down Alt, and then hit Control T for free transform. And now we can create different variations of this as well. And we could Control T, flip that vertically to give us some different shapes, different sizes. Control T, size that down. And I'm just going to create another branch, kind of have this split in the center. We're also going to be going through these different layers and, of course, deleting the sections we don't need. But right now what we're going to be keeping is just this branch kind of coming down through here. I'm going to go ahead and Alt and move so we can get another copy of that, kind of move that into place. Free transform, use our warp tool to give us some more variation, make it look a little bit different than our other one. And now what I'm going to do is just delete the sections we don't need. So with our first one, our first top layer, I'm going to go ahead, select the eraser tool, and just remove the areas we don't need. And we're going to go into our next layer down, remove that section, go to branch curved, and remove that area. So now we have this branch splitting off at the top, and we'll be able to paint in some better transitions in our intersection points as well, once we have the base shape a little more defined. We could use copies of some of these new ones we've created, move that down. Of course, in this case, looks like it might be a little small. And if I was to increase the scale of it now, what would happen is we'd get a little bit of blurring on the edge, and we really want to create a nice crisp clip map. So once we scale down these branches, we want to make sure that we're not scaling them back up, which is why we have these copies that we created. So we could bring those back and use them for our lower sections. And I'm going to warp that. And we could have these branches breaking off at their ends as well. We really just want to create a couple of different shapes, and you can of course create whatever shape you want, and really depends on the type of tree you want to create. But the whole idea of this is to really create a lot of different shapes you can use for a couple of different scenes, lots of different types of trees, and that way you have a nice template file for when you need to make more. And I'm going to pull that in a little bit, maybe warp that on the end. And then we can go ahead and copy that, flip it horizontally, change its shape a little, rotate it, warp it, and then the eraser tool to remove sections we don't need. And one thing I want to do is make sure that actually these branches on the end aren't as long as they are, because I think they're a little bit too long, which might not look right. So I'm going to go back to our branched curved copy, make another copy of that, bring it back in there. We're going to modify it to fit in. And then we're going to remove our original curve that we have. And then go back to some of those upper branches and kind of move those up. Maybe scale them down a little. Warp them and change their variation. And you could just tweak them until the point where you get to a branch that looks pretty good, where you want it. And let's go through and just delete those areas that are sticking out, and we can remove that curve. And that should be good for our basic shape. So I'm going to select all of these layers we just created and hit Control E in order to merge them all into one. And then I'm going to zoom in to our connections, and we can select the paintbrush tool, make a little bit of smaller brush, and just change these transitions. We could also use the eraser tool to kind of cut that out a little, just to make it look more realistic, and add a little bit of variation to it so it's not so smooth. We could also come through with that paintbrush tool and add little notches. We'll just add a couple of those to different areas. And you could extend some of the branches and the pieces out a little bit more. Really depends on how complex you want the branch shape to be. With this one that I'm creating right now, it's fairly simple, and really we're going to worry about using the view scene file in order to move these around and create as many copies as we need. And if you feel that the branch isn't thick enough, one thing we can do is double-click on our branch layer, and if we select stroke, change that to black, we can adjust the size, and I'm going to change this to center, but we can pull that out a little bit more, and that way we can thicken up our branches. Now you also see that we have a little bit of some jagged edges, and that has to do with the way we created our shapes. By using the warp tool, it does tend to skew our pixels a little bit. And if we take a look, we can see that they're not very crisp in some of the areas. So one thing we could do is use our magic wand tool, and I'm going to set our tolerance to 2, turn off anti-aliasing, and we can see that that's still selecting a little bit too much. Set our tolerance to 0. And basically, it's selecting some of that anti-aliased area on the outside of our branch. So we might have to take care of this a different way. To make it just a little bit crisper, I'm going to change our color to white. I'm going to select the paint bucket tool. And another thing I want to do at this point, since I'm kind of testing things out, because with every branch you might have to customize it different ways depending on how much there is of this shading and blending. I'm going to go over to our history palette, and on the bottom, the middle button, we can create a new snapshot. So now at any point, once we're working, we have this snapshot, and we can go back to the file as it is right now, the way our layers are saved, the way everything is set up. Any modifications we make now, we can always go back. We don't have to worry about losing anything. Another thing we could also do is make a copy of this and drag that into our copy folder, and that way we can go back to this version without having to go back to a snapshot. There's a lot of different ways you can kind of save your work within the file itself and without actually saving. I'm going to click in here a couple of times with that paint bucket tool on. We have anti-alias turned on, tolerance of 5, and you can see that we have really nice crisp edges. So the more times you click, the crisper it's going to get, and really the amount of times you need to do that really depends on how much blending you have on the edges of your branches. But right now we have branches that are going to be really crisp, and that should work out quite well. The only problem is now we have this white embedded into our branch, and if we don't want that, well, one thing we can do is use the magic wand tool, turn on, actually I'll leave anti-alias off and just take a look first, and that is going to leave some white edges. So I'll deselect, change our tolerance to 2, turn on anti-alias, and now select it. We can hit delete, and now we just have that black layer. Double click to open up layer style, select a stroke, change that to black, and now we can see that white edge from some of those leftover pixels. If we change this to inside, or sorry, change that to center, we can now expand and make our branches a little thicker without those showing up, and also having the ability to cover those up. So that's a really cool way to be able to make your branches a little bit larger after you've already worked on them. But it looks like this should be good now for at least our clip map. We are also going to need to create a color map for our branch. And I'm going to be using some bark textures and scaling them down and have them fit correctly. We can reposition them so they move along our branches and kind of use the clone stamp to blend those together and create a realistic looking bark map. If you are going to be creating trees that are just really far away and the overall look of that branch is really just going to show up as a basic color, then one thing you could do, it's really quick and easy, is you choose a color overlay. We'll just turn off the stroke. Let's go ahead and change this color to a brownish color. We could select a texture for bevel and emboss. And you could just pick something that looks a little more like bark. Adjust your depth and your scale. And that way, you could create something just really quickly for your color map. And really the best thing to do would be to use these styles on an entire layer, because that way you won't have to worry about your clip map blurring out the edges or getting into this white area. But that's a really quick and easy way to create a color map if you're not going to be zooming in too close to your branches. But I want to make sure that this has enough detail to show up, to look like a realistic branch if we were to zoom in close enough to the tree. So I'm going to load in a couple of different textures that we could use for branches and just kind of set those up. And I now have two different types of bark loaded in. These are from the Seamless Bark collection. And these two textures are located in the Content folder under Photoshop Reference, Bark Textures. And we have bark number 1 from the collection and number 74. And you can choose from these two in order to create the type of bark that you want. I'm just going to be using bark number 1, and I just want to drag this into our bark template file. We can go ahead and close that out. And I'm going to create a new group and just call this bark. And I'm going to drag that layer into it. And I'm going to need to scale this down quite a bit. So we'll just hit Control-T for free transform. And we just want this to match up with the size of that branch. And another thing that's really helpful too is using the same textures on the trunk of the tree that you're creating as you're using to create your branches, and that'll make it look even more realistic. So you can use the image maps both ways to create that different type of effect and look. Another thing I'm going to do is just adjust the levels. Control L on the keyboard. And I'm just going to darken this up a little. And then we can make some overall changes to it a little bit later. Create a color overlay. But what I'm going to do now is select the Move tool. And I'm going to go up to View and turn on Snap. Hold down Alt and just create a copy. And since this is a seamless texture, it'll blend right up. And it looks like we have a little bit of a pixel margin on the end. So just go ahead and delete that set of pixels and move that down. And then what I want to do is just hit Control E to copy that. Alt and move that up. And this time I'm going to hit Control T and just turn it off to the side a little. And just move it up to that edge, and also put that behind our other one. And we're just going to take a look at how it's going to look on the other branches. So we'll go ahead and copy that layer, our first one. And I'm going to move that into place to match up with the position of that branch on the side. Move that behind. Copy that again. Rotate it around the other way to match up with that branch. And then we'll also be using the warp tool a little to make that blend in a little bit better. Copy that, pull it up to the top, rotate that to the side. I'm going to move that under our other layers, and then make one more copy and bring that over. And I'm going to select our group right now, and we can see that a lot of these layers are not currently in our group. So go ahead and drag those in, select our bark, and I'm going to adjust the opacity value of the entire group. So we're not modifying the individual files, but just the way we're looking at them through the group, and that way we can see our shape behind in order to make our adjustments to each individual texture layer that we have. So now we're going to take this branch on the left, Control T, select warp, and I just want to warp this to match up with our shape, and we're also going to be pulling that in a little bit so that the little pieces of bark get smaller towards the end. And I'm going to make this one go over our first one, and then we can use the eraser tool to blend that in. We'll go ahead and select our branch on the right, on the bottom, move that up above, and then we can zoom in a little so we can see it a little bit better. Control T, select warp, and then move this one into position as well. And we'll just move that over a little, move that side up. And now this isn't entirely necessary, but I like to add just that extra little bit of detail and just have everything match up as much as possible. Control T, we're going to warp, and we're going to change this top one. And then we're going to move over to the one just to the left of it and warp that. And then we can select the center one, warp it, maybe move it in a little more, pull that off to the side. And then our first one, we'll just go ahead and modify that to match up with that curve. And now we can bring our opacity of our entire group back up to 100% and start making our adjustments to the textures and basically just erasing the areas. Because it's such a small image file, you're really not going to see the seams anyway. But just to remove some of those different areas, just go ahead and select our eraser tool and bring our hardness down to around 50%. And erase some of these sections to make that blend in a little bit better. We'll go down to the bottom. We'll erase the top over here. And then we'll move to our branches on the sides. We'll go ahead and blend that. And then this one as well. And that should work out pretty good to fit in with our branches and our overall shape. And if you create any other branch shapes out of our original branch that we created, You can use the same method with the textures to match that up, or you could just really quickly and easily just place the texture over it and not make the image kind of move along with the branches if you just want to do it very quickly, or if you're going to be pretty far away from the tree and not have to worry about that. And I'm going to save this out, and it'll be available in the content folder. And then we're going to take a look at saving out the color map and also saving out our clip map. And then we're going to go back to our leaf that we created earlier and save out a color map for that. And we can go into View and start setting up our scene. So what we're seeing right now is going to be our color, and we can save out just the file as it is right now for our color. You can save that as a bitmap or a JPEG, really depending on how big you want the file size. Sometimes a JPEG will reduce that overall size, but JPEGs can sometimes have a little bit of distortion depending on the compression settings you're using. So we'll use this as our color, and I'm going to go ahead and turn off the bark. And I'm going to create a copy of our branch. And because we're using that stroke to make our branches a little bit thicker, what we need to do before we can save out our final file for the alpha is we can flatten this layer and then create another stroke that's white to cut off the edges a little bit more. But because our bark and our color is really going way out of bounds of the branch itself, we don't need to do that. So that's one nice thing about having all this extra information, is we're not going to have to worry about any white lines showing up from a clip map that has a little bit of white edges in some of the colored areas. So now we can save this out as our clip. And I'm going to open up our leaf image. And I'm going to go into our layer style for our leaf shape. And I'm going to turn off that glow and just have that inner shadow, adjust the opacity a little, turn on the drop shadow, change our distance, match our opacity 20%, and increase our size. And that way we have a really nice blend around the edge. So if the clip map does go over, then we won't have a really harsh cutoff. And we can turn on our middle shadow. I'm going to use the small one, adjust the opacity, make it a little bit darker. And now we can save this out as our color map. And we are going to turn on our shape and turn on our alpha, making sure we turn off the middle shadow. And now we have our clip. So we can go ahead and save this out as our clip map or our alpha. And now we'll be going into View and loading these in order to create our first setup scene.